The modern protein industry is worth tens of billions of dollars. Powders, bars, shakes, an entire economy built around a problem people in the ancient world never had, because they already had it figured out. The Bible isn't just a spiritual document. Woven through its pages are food systems, specific animals, legumes, grains, and seeds that kept people physically strong enough to cross deserts, build cities, survive wars, and outlast empires. They weren't guessing at nutrition. They were observing it across generations and recording what worked. Today we're breaking down 13 of the most powerful protein sources in the biblical world, where they appear in Scripture, and what modern research actually says about them. Stay tuned, because the entry at number 4 is one of the most complete foods in nature, and most people toss it without a second thought. And number 1 is going to challenge every assumption you have about what serious nutrition actually looks like. Let's get started. Number 13, fish, the protein the disciples pulled from the sea. The Sea of Galilee was not a scenic backdrop. It was a working economy. Fishing families on that water weren't doing it for leisure. They were doing it because fish was the primary affordable protein source for ordinary people across the entire region. When Jesus called his first disciples, he didn't walk into a temple. He walked to the shore and found men who already understood something essential about how the body gets fed. Fish, particularly the smaller species common to biblical waters, sardines, tilapia, carp, delivered something that grain-based diets couldn't match on their own: complete protein. All 9 essential amino acids in a single food, with a digestibility score that outperforms most other sources. But the compound that doesn't get enough attention here is taurine. Fish, especially oily species, are among the few meaningful dietary sources of this amino acid. Taurine doesn't get the cultural attention that omega-3s do, but its role in cardiovascular health, bile salt formation, and neurological function is well documented. It supports the electrical activity of the heart, assists in fat digestion, and research suggests it may play a role in protecting against the kind of age-related cellular damage that accumulates silently over decades. The omega-3 fatty acids in fish do something most other protein sources can't claim. They directly reduce systemic inflammation while providing protein simultaneously. That dual action is rare. You're not just building tissue. You're lowering the inflammatory burden that would otherwise start breaking it down. Small, oily fish eaten whole, bones and all, also provide calcium at levels that rival dairy, along with phosphorus, selenium, and vitamin D, a nutrient that a substantial percentage of the modern world is chronically short of. Grill it over a fire, the way it was always prepared. Nothing complicated. The disciples weren't overthinking it, and neither should you. Number 12, fava beans, the oldest cultivated legume on Earth. Fava beans predate almost everything else on this list. Archaeobotanical evidence places their cultivation across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean as far back as 6000 BCE, which means people were growing and eating these long before most of the civilizations we read about in the Bible even existed. By the time the Israelites were farming in Canaan, fava beans weren't a new discovery. They were an established foundation. What makes fava beans nutritionally significant isn't any single compound. It's the density. A single cooked cup delivers roughly 13 grams of protein alongside folate levels that approach the full recommended daily intake in one sitting. Folate is the B vitamin directly responsible for DNA synthesis and repair. Every time a cell divides in your body, folate is required for the process to happen correctly. Deficiency doesn't announce itself loudly. It quietly undermines everything from red blood cell production to fetal neural development to the maintenance of cardiovascular health over time. Fava beans are also one of the better plant-based sources of L-dopa, the precursor to dopamine. This has made them a subject of genuine interest in neurological research, particularly in the context of Parkinson's disease, where dopamine-producing neurons are progressively lost. The research is still early, but the signal is real enough that it keeps attracting serious scientific attention. The iron in fava beans is paired naturally with vitamin C in traditional preparations, pickled, marinated, cooked with citrus or herbs, which significantly improves absorption. That pairing isn't accidental. It's the kind of nutritional synergy that gets encoded into cuisine when people are paying close enough attention to what their bodies actually need. High in fiber, rich in manganese and copper, and one of the most nitrogen-fixing crops ever cultivated, Fava beans fed ancient populations and kept their soil alive at the same time. Number 11. Lamb, the meat that rebuilt. What hard living took out. No animal carries more ceremonial weight across biblical scripture than the lamb, the Passover sacrifice. The ram caught in the thicket when Abraham raised his knife. The image runs through the entire Old Testament and into the New with a consistency that tells you how central this animal was to the people who wrote it. But strip away the symbolism, and what you have is one of the most nutrient-dense animal proteins ever documented. Lamb is exceptionally rich in carnitine, a compound synthesized in the body from lysine and methionine, two amino acids that lamb provides in abundance. Carnitine's job is transporting long-chain fatty acids into the mitochondria, where they're burned for energy. Without adequate carnitine, fat metabolism is impaired. Energy production becomes less efficient. Research on carnitine supplementation consistently shows benefits for physical performance, cardiovascular function, and recovery from intense exertion. Exactly the conditions that biblical laborers, soldiers, and travelers were dealing with every single day. Lamb also contains conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA, a naturally occurring fatty acid found primarily in the meat and dairy of grass-fed ruminants. CLA has been studied for its role in body composition, immune modulation, and anti-cancer activity across multiple laboratory models. Pastured lamb, the kind raised the way it always was in the ancient world, carries significantly higher CLA concentrations than grain-finished commercial alternatives. The zinc in lamb is highly bioavailable and present in quantities that make it one of the most effective dietary sources. Zinc drives immune response, wound healing, testosterone production, and the activity of over 300 enzymes inside the body. Plant-based zinc exists, but the phytic acid in grains and legumes binds it and limits how much you actually absorb. From lamb, the zinc goes in without that barrier. Slow roasted, as it was always prepared, the heat breaks down connective tissue into collagen peptides, and the fat carries fat-soluble vitamins that would otherwise be harder to absorb. Number 10. Lentils, the legume that anchors. Every longevity study, Genesis 25, is one of the most famous transactions in all of Scripture. Esau comes in from the field depleted, running on empty, and trades his entire birthright for a bowl of what Jacob is cooking. For centuries, that moment has been read as a story about impulsiveness. But there's another way to read it, as a precise account of what extreme protein and nutrient depletion does to decision-making and the speed at which lentils correct it. Lentils are consistently at the top of global longevity research. A study tracking populations across Japan, Sweden, Greece, and Australia found that legume consumption was the single dietary factor most reliably correlated with healthy aging across every culture studied. Not protein shakes, not supplements. Beans eaten consistently over a lifetime. The protein in lentils is substantial, around 18 grams per cooked cup, and arrives alongside a fiber and resistant starch profile that slows digestion and produces a blood sugar response flat enough that they're used therapeutically in diabetic diet management. The resistant starch feeds bifidobacterium and lactobacillus strains in the colon, with downstream effects on systemic inflammation, insulin sensitivity, and the gut-brain axis that researchers are still mapping. Folate is present in concentrations that rival fava beans. Lentils are one of the most reliable plant-based sources of iron, and pairing them with a vitamin C source, as traditional preparations across the Middle East have always done, lifts iron absorption significantly. The manganese, potassium, and molybdenum content rounds out a nutritional profile that doesn't have many obvious gaps. They're also one of the fastest cooking legumes without soaking. Ancient people didn't have a lot of time to stand over a pot. Neither do most people now. A food that is nutritionally complete, fast to prepare, and has been feeding human beings for 10,000 years doesn't need reinventing. Number 9. Cheese and dairy. The fermented protein the patriarchs kept close. When Abraham rushed to serve the 3 visitors in Genesis 18, the meal he set before them included butter and milk alongside the calf he had prepared. When David received provisions in the wilderness, curds appeared in the list. Dairy wasn't incidental in the ancient world. It was a reliable, portable, shelf-stable protein source that required no fire and no preparation. The protein in fermented dairy, cheese, yogurt, kefir, cultured curds, is different in a meaningful way from what you find in a glass of fresh milk. Fermentation partially pre-digests the proteins, breaking casein and whey into shorter peptide chains that are easier for the gut to process and absorb. This is part of why fermented dairy products have been tolerated across populations that historically struggled with raw milk. Whey protein, which concentrates during cheese making, is one of the most leucine-dense proteins available from any food source. Leucine isn't just another amino acid. It's the primary trigger for muscle protein synthesis, the signal that tells your body to build and repair muscle tissue. A whey protein concentrate from aged cheese delivers that leucine signal effectively, which is why modern sports nutrition has spent decades trying to replicate in powder form what cheesemakers have been doing naturally for millennia. Fermented dairy also delivers live bacteria that shift gut ecology in measurable ways. Research on regular yogurt and kefir consumption consistently shows improvements in microbiome diversity, reduced inflammatory markers, and stronger immune responses. The connection between fermented food intake and mental health outcomes is one of the more active areas of current research, with fermented dairy appearing in multiple trials alongside benefits for mood and anxiety. Calcium in dairy is paired with vitamin K2 in aged cheeses, a combination that research now links specifically to arterial health and bone density in ways that calcium supplementation alone doesn't replicate. Number 8. Goat, the protein of the ancient poor. Goats appear throughout Scripture in a way that cattle and sheep don't quite match. They were the animal of common people, affordable to keep, adaptable to rough terrain, productive year-round. When Proverbs 27 says, "You will have enough goat's milk to feed your family," that wasn't poetic license. Goat was the everyday protein for most people in the biblical world, not a special occasion food. What modern nutritional analysis reveals about goat meat is that the poor man's protein happened to be one of the better ones. Goat is significantly leaner than beef or pork, with a fat composition that sits closer to what research associates with reduced cardiovascular risk. The saturated fat content is lower, and the ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat is more favorable than most other red meats by comparison. The protein content is comparable to beef gram for gram, but the caloric load is lighter. For populations doing intense physical labor, building, farming, herding, this ratio of protein to calories made goat extremely efficient nutrition. You got the muscle-building amino acids without the caloric surplus that comes with fattier cuts of other animals. Goat meat is also one of the better dietary sources of iron and B12 in a form that the body processes efficiently. The B12 content is critical for neurological function and red blood cell production, a vitamin entirely absent from plant foods, which means every vegetable-heavy diet in the ancient world needed an animal source to complete the picture. Goat provided that reliably and affordably. The selenium in goat meat supports thyroid function and contributes to the antioxidant enzyme systems that manage oxidative stress. Traditional preparations, slow braised, stewed with root vegetables and herbs, break down the collagen in tougher cuts into gelatin, adding a connective tissue benefit on top of the muscle protein. Number 7. Almonds, the nut coded into the most sacred architecture ever built. When God gave Moses the blueprint for the menorah, the 7-branched lampstand at the center of the tabernacle, the cups were to be shaped like almond blossoms. Not generic flowers, not grape clusters. Almonds, specifically, pressed into sacred metalwork at the heart of Israel's worship. Aaron's rod, the one chosen among all the tribal staffs to signal divine authority, was the one that budded overnight and produced almonds. A civilization doesn't build a nut into its holiest objects unless that nut has earned something. For protein purposes, the story centers on arginine, an amino acid almonds deliver in unusually high concentrations. Arginine is the direct precursor to nitric oxide, the signaling molecule that causes blood vessel walls to relax and widen. Improved nitric oxide availability means better circulation, lower blood pressure, and more efficient delivery of oxygen and nutrients to tissues throughout the body. Clinical trials have demonstrated measurable reductions in blood pressure markers with regular almond consumption, and the arginine pathway is a significant part of the explanation. The protein in almonds, roughly 6 grams per ounce, arrives packaged with a fiber structure that partially blocks fat absorption during digestion. Research has confirmed that the body absorbs roughly 20% fewer calories from almonds than the nutrition label would suggest, because some of the fat trapped inside intact cell walls passes through into the colon, where it feeds gut bacteria instead of being stored. Magnesium in almonds is present at levels that make them one of the best whole food sources available. Given that studies estimate a large portion of people in Western populations are chronically under-consuming magnesium, a mineral involved in over 300 enzymatic reactions, the regular almond consumption of ancient populations may have been doing more silent work than anyone realized. They were eating something the ancient world considered sacred. The research keeps explaining why. Number 6. Chickpeas. 10,000 years of unbroken evidence. Chickpeas don't have a dramatic scripture moment. No prophet singles them out. No king builds a monument to them. They were simply always there, eaten across the entire ancient Near East for at least 10 millennia, ground into flour, boiled into stews, dried and carried on long journeys. Foods that persist for that long, without a single advocate other than direct human experience, are foods that genuinely work. The protein content is solid, around 15 grams per cooked cup. But what separates chickpeas from most protein sources is what accompanies it. The glycemic response from chickpeas is among the lowest of any carbohydrate-containing food ever measured. Researchers have documented blood sugar curves after chickpea consumption that are nearly flat despite meaningful carbohydrate content, driven by a combination of resistant starch, soluble fiber, and the protein itself, slowing gastric emptying. Saponins, a class of compounds concentrated in chickpeas, have attracted genuine scientific interest for their apparent ability to bind bile acids and cholesterol in the digestive tract, pulling them out of circulation before reabsorption can occur. The effect on LDL levels over consistent consumption has been documented in multiple trials. Chickpeas are also among the richest plant-based sources of manganese, a trace mineral that functions as a cofactor for the enzyme superoxide dismutase, one of the body's primary defenses against oxidative damage at the cellular level. Manganese deficiency impairs this defense system quietly and over time in ways that accelerate cellular aging. The folate content rivals fava, beans, and lentils. The iron is meaningful with the right preparation, and the phosphorus content supports bone mineral density in ways that the calcium-only conversation around bone health tends to overlook. 10,000 years of consistent human use. No rebranding needed. Just a pot and some heat and the patience to keep eating them. Number 5. Quail, the meat that fell from the sky. Numbers 11 is one of the stranger passages in the Torah. The Israelites are exhausted, frustrated, and craving meat. The complaint reaches God, and what happens next is hard to explain away as metaphor. A wind drives enormous flocks of quail in from the sea, dropping them around the camp to a depth of 3 feet for a full day's walk in every direction. Millions of people, enough quail to eat for a month. Whatever your theological reading of that event, the nutritional picture is clear. Quail is one of the most complete small proteins in the natural world. The selenium content per serving is remarkable. A standard quail serving can cover the full recommended daily requirement for selenium in a single meal. Selenium isn't a glamorous mineral, but its function is critical. It's the core component of selenoprotein P, the protein responsible for distributing selenium throughout the body, and it sits at the center of thyroid hormone conversion and the glutathione antioxidant system. Low selenium is consistently linked to impaired immune function, slower wound healing, and increased vulnerability to oxidative stress. Quail delivers complete protein, all essential amino acids, at a concentration that competes with chicken breast, with a fat profile that is leaner and carries a better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than most commercially raised poultry. For people in a desert environment doing heavy physical work with limited food variety, quail represented concentrated recovery nutrition, protein, B vitamins, iron, zinc, and phosphorus in a package that required no processing, no grinding, no preparation beyond cooking directly over fire. Phosphorus is often the forgotten bone mineral. It makes up roughly 85% of the mineral content in human bones alongside calcium, and it's required for ATP synthesis, the energy currency of every cell in the body. Quail provides it generously. The ancient world didn't need to analyze it. They just needed to eat it, and they did. Number 4. Eggs, the most complete food in the natural world. The egg appears across biblical literature not as a food, but as a symbol of life, fertility, and potential so absolute that no culture has ever needed to explain why. It's obvious. A complete living thing, contained, self-sufficient, requiring nothing added to become what it's meant to become. That biological completeness isn't symbolic in the nutritional sense, it's literal. An egg contains everything required to build a living body from scratch. That means the amino acid profile is essentially perfect from a human nutritional standpoint. But what deserves more attention than the protein is the choline. Choline is classified as an essential nutrient, meaning your body cannot produce enough on its own and must get it from food. Eggs are the single most concentrated dietary source that most people actually eat regularly. 2 eggs provide roughly half the daily adequate intake for choline, which sounds fine until you realize that surveys consistently show the majority of people in developed countries are consuming far below even that threshold. Choline is the precursor to acetylcholine, one of the primary neurotransmitters driving memory, muscle control, and attention. It's also required for phosphatidylcholine synthesis, the dominant structural component of every cell membrane in the body. During pregnancy, choline demand increases dramatically, and inadequate intake during fetal development is now associated with measurable reductions in cognitive function that persist into childhood. The leucine content in egg protein is high enough to trigger muscle protein synthesis effectively, a function that becomes increasingly important with age as the body's anabolic sensitivity declines, and the threshold for triggering muscle repair rises. Yolk and white together, not separated, not powdered, not processed into a product with a long ingredient list. The whole egg, eaten whole, the way people ate them for thousands of years without a single nutritional concern about it. That's the version that works. Number 3, pistachios, the nut, with a cardiovascular secret. Here's what the research on pistachios keeps finding, and it keeps surprising people who haven't been following it. Of all the commonly studied nuts, almonds, walnuts, cashews, pecans, pistachios consistently produce the strongest reductions in LDL cholesterol in head-to-head dietary trials. The effect size isn't marginal. It's meaningful enough to be clinically significant for people with borderline cardiovascular risk. The mechanism isn't a single compound, it's a combination. Phytosterols in pistachios compete with dietary cholesterol for absorption sites in the small intestine, effectively crowding it out before it can enter circulation. The arginine content stimulates nitric oxide production, relaxing arterial walls and reducing the mechanical stress that contributes to plaque formation over time. The polyphenol antioxidants, including resveratrol, which appears in pistachios at concentrations few people would expect, reduce LDL oxidation, the process that turns cholesterol from a neutral molecule into a damaging one. Resveratrol has been heavily studied for its potential role in longevity pathways, specifically its apparent ability to activate sirtuins, proteins associated with cellular repair and metabolic regulation. Most people associate resveratrol with red wine. Pistachios are a source that doesn't come with the downsides. Protein-wise, pistachios are the highest protein nut by weight among commonly available options, and their amino acid profile is unusually complete for a plant food. The prebiotic fiber reaches the colon mostly intact, where clinical studies show it significantly increases bifidobacterium populations, beneficial bacteria whose abundance is consistently correlated with reduced inflammation and better immune regulation. The fat structure means a meaningful portion of it passes through unabsorbed, feeding bacteria instead. More satiety, fewer net calories than the label implies. A food that has been eaten across the ancient world for millennia, delivering benefits that nutritional science spent decades catching up to. Number 2, Ezekiel bread. The bread God dictated the recipe for. Ezekiel 4:9 is one of the most specific dietary instructions in all of Scripture. God tells the prophet exactly what to eat: wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, combined into a single bread. 6 ingredients, a precise formula. The context is survival. Ezekiel would subsist on this bread during a prolonged period of symbolic siege. And what those 6 ingredients produce together is something that modern nutritional science finds genuinely remarkable. When you combine grains and legumes in a single food, something happens to the protein. Grains are typically low in lysine, legumes are low in methionine. Together, they cover each other's gaps. The combination produces a complete amino acid profile, the same one you'd expect from animal protein, from entirely plant-based ingredients. This principle of protein complementation wasn't discovered in a laboratory. It was encoded into this bread thousands of years before biochemistry existed. The sprouting process, which traditional Ezekiel bread production uses, significantly changes the nutritional profile of the grains and legumes. Sprouting activates enzymes that break down phytic acid, the compound that binds minerals like zinc, iron, and magnesium in raw grains, and reduces their absorption. After sprouting, the bioavailability of those minerals increases substantially. Protein digestibility improves. Gluten structure is partially altered in ways that some people with grain sensitivities tolerate better. The fiber content from the legume inclusion, lentils and beans, produces a glycemic response dramatically lower than any conventional bread. The combination of soluble and insoluble fiber feeds a diverse range of gut bacteria and supports the short-chain fatty acid production that regulates intestinal inflammation. This wasn't a recipe someone arrived at through trial and error over generations. It was given as an instruction, recorded precisely, and preserved. The nutritional logic behind it is sound in ways that would have been impossible to reverse engineer without knowing exactly what to look for. Number 1. Locusts, the protein source that should have never been forgotten. This is the one that stops people, the one where the initial reaction is visceral, instinctive, and wrong. Matthew 3:4. John the Baptist lived in the Judean wilderness wearing camel hair, eating locusts and wild honey. Most people read that line as a detail about deprivation. This was a man living rough, eating whatever the desert offered. That reading is completely backwards. Locusts weren't a last resort. They were listed explicitly in Leviticus 11 as a clean food permitted for consumption. They were a recognized, respected, nutritionally serious food source across the entire ancient Near East. And modern entomological nutrition research has spent years documenting what ancient populations understood through direct experience. Locusts contain up to 70% protein by dry weight. To put that in perspective, beef averages around 25% and chicken around 27%. The locust isn't a compromised protein source. It outperforms most conventional ones by the most basic measurement available. The amino acid profile is complete. All essential amino acids are present in proportions that support muscle protein synthesis effectively. The iron is in a highly absorbable form, the zinc is meaningful, and the B12 content makes locusts one of the few non-animal sources of a vitamin that's otherwise only reliably available from meat, fish, and dairy. The fat content is low, and the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is dramatically better than most industrially raised animal proteins. Gram for gram, the environmental footprint of producing locust protein is a fraction of any conventional livestock operation, a fact that has nutritionists, food scientists, and sustainability researchers paying very serious attention. John the Baptist wasn't compromising. He was eating one of the most protein-dense, nutrient-complete foods available in his environment, and maintaining the kind of mental sharpness and physical endurance that allowed him to operate for years in conditions that would have finished most people quickly. For thousands of years, people relied on certain foods because they consistently made them feel healthier, stronger, and more resilient. Now, modern nutritional science is reaching many of those same conclusions, mechanism by mechanism, study by study, confirming what ancient populations learned simply by paying attention to their bodies across generations. The gap between what heals and what's convenient has never been wider. Most of what gets marketed as protein today is a pale imitation of a system that was already working before anyone thought to write it down. Pick one food from this list that you're not currently eating. Source the best version you can find. Eat it consistently for 30 days, and pay attention. That's how the ancient world figured all of this out. Direct experience, repeated over time. If you enjoy my content, hit the like button and subscribe. I put out new content every week across nutrition, biblical food history, and evidence-based wellness. And if there are topics you'd like me to cover next, drop them in the comments below.